Thank you for turning into Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Lucy Port, and I'm the daughter of Bernie and Helen Zelinger. Both of my parents were born in Poland and are Holocaust survivors. I'm honored to share my family history with you, and today I'm going to focus on the story of my dad's survival. It's a story of love and relationships, courage, resistance, and perseverance. My dad lived with a firm resolve to bear witness to the tragedy of the Holocaust. He wanted to document the atrocities that were carried out among his immediate and extended families, his friends, and those strangers who he shared only one common denominator with. They were all Jews. That resolve was a driving force that enabled him to survive the numerous close encounters with death that he first faced as a young teenager. I'm thankful that years ago, my dad and I worked together to bring many of his wartime memories to the surface, and he published his memoirs in a book called Into Harm's Way. My dad suffered from dementia and passed away at the age of 99, just 2 months short of his 100th birthday. During the last few years of his life, he lost his ability to communicate verbally and had severe cognitive impairment. I couldn't always tell what he was thinking or what he wanted to say, but I'm sure he would be fulfilled to know that his legacy is being passed on to future generations by the telling of his story. You'll notice that I have just a few pre-war photos of my dad, his family, and his friends. Most of his documents and photographs were destroyed or lost in the war. In fact, my dad lived his entire adult life with only 2 photos of his mother and sister, and not a single photographic memory of his beloved father. My dad lived most of his childhood life in the Polish city of Kielce. Whoops. Sorry, I was going to show you Kielce on the map. It's located about halfway between Warsaw and Krakow. Jewish people first settled in Kielce in 1868, and by 1939, approximately 25,000 Jewish people lived there in a general population of about 80,000 people. Kielce was once an important center of limestone mining, and the area was famous for its natural resources of copper, lead, and iron. On the eve of World War II, there were close to 18,000 Jews living in the city. Between the onset of the war in September of 1939 and up until March of 1940, the Jewish population of Kielce expanded to over 28,000. The expansion occurred under the Nazi occupation when displaced Jews from other Polish cities like Łódź and Poznan, as well as Jews from Vienna, were forced to leave their homes and resettle in cities where ghettos had been created by the Nazis. My dad was born on his grandfather's farm in Czernocin, Poland, which is about 74 miles from Kielce. It was December of 1920. At the time, his father Bronislaw, his mother Hanna, and his sister Lucia all lived together on the farm. My dad's grandfather, Moshe Simcha Zelinger, and his grandmother Perla loved living a simple life on the outskirts of the city. His maternal grandparents lived in Bodzentin. Bodzentin was a smaller village or shtetl located about 15 miles from Kielce. The majority of the people living there were Jewish and had little interaction with the neighboring non-Jewish community. This grandfather was a lawyer and was the elected president of the Jewish community for many years. Life in Bodzentin was very different than the experiences of his other grandparents who lived on the farm. And after a few years, my dad and his family moved to Kielce and lived in an apartment building located directly across from the Kielce City Hall. My dad's father was the executive director of a plant which manufactured quicklime and gypsum. The plant was located in Tokarnia, which is about 12.5 miles from Kielce. His family owned a second apartment at the plant so that his dad wouldn't have to travel back and forth from Kielce during the work week. My grandfather would stay in Tokarnia during the week and take the train to Kielce when he wasn't needed at the plant. My dad often stayed at the Tokarnia apartment, especially in springtime after the cold winter weather was over. He would travel back and forth to school by train. He loved spending summer vacations in Tokarnia as it provided a lot of open space for playing and exploring. There were open fields of corn, rye, and hay adjacent to the plant. And my dad used to love going into the fields at harvest time to help the workers pick the crops. The plant was still in existence when my family traveled to Poland in 1995, and this is a photo of my dad standing next to the gates of the factory. My dad's mother, Hannah, who you can see in this picture with his sister, was a midwife in Bozenton. She provided medical care for pregnant women and assisted with the delivery of their babies. She continued her practice when they moved to Celts and became a well-respected colleague in the Celts Jewish medical community. My dad adored his older sister, Lucia. She worked in the office of their father's factory until the outbreak of the war. My dad attended a Jewish elementary school. He's this little boy sitting here right next to the right of the teacher. And this is his best friend, Jake, to the left of the teacher. It's one of the only photos, it is the only photo that he was able to retain from the war of him at this young of an age. His first year of high school, he went to a public school which accepted both Jewish and non-Jewish students. But by the beginning of his second high school year, he was forced to switch to an all-Jewish high school. Anti-Semitism began to flourish in the early 1930s as Hitler rose to political power in Germany. Posters and graffiti appeared on the streets of the city, urging its citizens not to buy from Jewish stores and calling for the Jews to leave Poland. By 1935, the Nuremberg laws were created in Germany, announcing a series of anti-Semitic actions. Jews and German citizens were not allowed to date or marry. Jews were forbidden to employ German women under the age of 45, and eventually Jews were not even considered German citizens and had no legal rights. In Celts, my dad's school was a 30-minute walk from his home. While walking to school, Christian boys would often pick fights with him and his friends just because they were Jewish. They were often forced to walk only on the left side of the street, since the right side was reserved for non-Jews. My dad often fought back. He was an extremely strong teenager, and he was very proud of the fact that he was the school's champion arm wrestler. I believe this physical strength was a huge asset during his wartime struggle for survival. His high school class consisted of only 9 Jewish boys. 4 of those 9 ultimately survived the war. This is my dad. This is his friend Sydney, in the center of the picture, who was sentenced ultimately to the same slave labor camp as my dad. And this is his friend Jake, who was in the little elementary school picture. They all survived with their own unique wartime experiences, ultimately settling in Chicago and becoming part of our extended family. This is a picture of my dad and Jake, who remained best friends throughout most of their lives. My dad attended Lyceum, or 2 years of college prep, from 1937 to 1939. He majored in medicine and graduated on May 12th of 1939. He planned to attend medical school in Paris because it was almost impossible for a Jew to be admitted to a Polish medical school. Anti-Semitism had become more pervasive. Jews lost their jobs and were barely able to provide food and shelter for their families. Visas to leave Poland cost close to $2,500 in today's dollars, so very few people could afford the opportunity to leave their homes and country of birth. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a mutual non-aggression pact. The Soviets planned to invade and take over eastern Poland, while the Nazis would invade and dominate the West. And you can see those changes on the map. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Polish government ordered all young men to join the Polish army on the Eastern Front. My grandparents were terrified that my dad would not survive and urged him to escape from Celts. My dad's uncle Henrik had a car, and so my grandparents made the difficult decision for my dad and his uncle to leave Celts for a few days, thinking that they would return when the situation wasn't as dangerous. They packed some food and extra clothes and drove out of Celts, and the chaos they encountered was unimaginable. Mobs of people crushed together with whatever belongings they could carry were trying to leave the city. Uncle Henrik's car broke down, and my dad and his uncle were forced to join the mass of people fleeing the city on foot. They got separated while they were being pushed along with the crowds. And in the midst of his panic at losing his uncle, my dad kept walking, thinking that he'd eventually find him. German fighter bombers flew over the fleeing crowd, repeatedly firing machine guns and killing indiscriminately. After days of travel, my dad never found his uncle and ended up in a makeshift refugee center in Lutsk, which was close to the Soviet border and about 82 miles from Kelts. While there for almost 2 weeks, he had given up hope of reuniting with his uncle and was heartbroken because he didn't know if he would ever see his family again. While in Lutsk, he met a high-ranking Soviet officer. He told the officer how he had lost his uncle, was completely alone, and was unsure of how to return to Kelts. Perhaps taking pity on my dad, the officer offered him a job in the kitchen of the Soviet internal police building. My dad took the job since, at the very least, it would provide him with access to food while he worked in the kitchen. My dad was very good with languages and quickly learned to speak passable Russian. He told this officer of his plan to become a doctor, and the officer actually offered to give him a letter of recommendation to the medical school in Kiev. At this point, thinking that he would never see his family again, he traveled to Kiev, which is designated by the arrow, which was over 400 miles away from Kelts. He presented his letter of recommendation and was admitted to medical school. People at the school didn't know that he was Jewish. While there, he began to sense some underlying anti-Semitism and was very uncomfortable with the communist ideology. He grew fearful of staying there and was terribly homesick. In fact, he would often go to the Kiev train station platform and call out, "Kelts, Kelts," through the open windows of passing trains, hoping that someone fleeing Poland, and particularly Kelts, would hear him and give him news of his family. Lo and behold, one day, one of the Kelts doctors who worked closely with his mother was on a train. He heard my dad shouting out and recognized him. My grandparents had begged the doctor to keep an eye out for my dad, and if by chance he was found, they wanted my dad to know that they were desperate to have him return home. He made immediate plans to return to Kelts, but it was going to be a treacherous journey since he had to smuggle himself across the border and return to German-occupied Poland. So now the arrow on the map is going in reverse. His overwhelming desire to be reunited with his family and hopefully with his uncle suppressed any fears about the danger living under German occupation. I think that's why he titled his book Into Harm's Way, because that's exactly what this journey entailed. He collected his meager possessions and bought a train ticket to Lvov. In Lvov, he lived with a Jewish family for a short while and worked whatever odd jobs he could find to make some money. He would often visit a coffee house where many Jewish refugees congregated, and one day by chance, he met a friend from Kelts in the coffee house who also wanted to return to his home in Poland, and they devised a plan to travel together. In November of 1939, the Nazis forced all Jews in occupied Poland to wear white armbands with a blue Jewish star over their clothing. If police found a Jewish person not wearing the armband, they could be killed on the spot or sent to a concentration camp. My dad and his friend Meyer created the white armbands and took the train to a city closest to the new border. They had to be extremely careful because there were Soviet internal police at the station. They contacted a Ukrainian smuggler who was familiar with the area and paid the smuggler to get them to the border as covertly as possible. It was the middle of a brutally cold winter, and this man led them to a river frozen over with ice. He then refused to take my dad and Meyer any further. Determined to get home, the two Polish teenagers crossed the frozen river into German-occupied Poland. They were quickly captured and severely beaten by German soldiers. Once the beatings were over, the soldiers surprisingly released them and allowed them to literally run for their lives. My dad never knew the reason why they weren't killed after being beaten. They boarded a train to Kelts and arrived there past curfew. My dad had to use secret alleyways to avoid detection and arrived at his home. Having no key and not knowing who might now be living in the apartment, he knocked softly on the door. He heard his sister's voice asking who was there. When she opened the door, he fell into the loving embrace of his shocked family. His family's existence in Kelts had dramatically changed since his absence. On the 5th day of the war, the Polish administration fled the city and surrendered to the Germans. The Germans took over my grandfather's manufacturing plant and decreed that Jews could no longer work there. 1 month later, Jews were being arrested and tortured for no apparent reason other than their religion. Jewish homes were broken into and valuables stolen. The Germans ordered the Jewish communities to form Judenrats. These were councils of Jewish men who were responsible for the internal security, shelter, and organization of forced labor for the Germans. By January of 1940, the Germans ordered all men between the ages of 14 to 60 to forced labor with no pay. Jews received ration cards, but were only allowed to buy half the amount of items allotted to the general Polish population. And Jews could not use any form of public transportation without an official permit. By the fall of 1940, the Germans physically began to close in the Jews. First, they surrounded a predominantly Jewish area with barbed wire, and by April of 1941, they formed a ghetto. The sign in this photo says, "Any person climbing the fence will be shot." In just 4 days, all Jews were forced to leave their homes and relocate within the walled-off and barbed wire confines of the ghetto. My dad and his family were forced to vacate their beautiful apartment and were moved to a 2-room apartment on Yasna Street within the ghetto. When my dad traveled to Kelts many years ago, he found his original home, and these are photos of him walking up the steps to the apartment. This is a rendering of the Kelts ghetto showing the streets and buildings contained within the barbed wire walls. In the ghetto, my dad's family was forced to share that 2-room apartment with an elderly German couple who had been relocated to Kelts. The German couple slept on the floor of the small kitchen, while the 4 members of my dad's family shared the 1 remaining room. Within the ghetto, my grandfather was put in charge of all things related to agriculture, like the growing and maintaining of trees and vegetable gardens, in an effort to provide additional food to the ghetto population. My dad's sister and mother worked in the ghetto hospital, and this is a picture of his sister in the hospital. My dad initially worked as a paramedic, spraying disinfectant into ghetto homes in an attempt to control the typhus epidemic that led to the death of close to 4,000 people. Stories were beginning to spread that Nazis were rounding up and evacuating Jews from Warsaw and other ghettos. By August of 1942, the Kelts ghetto, holding 28,000 Jews, was completely sealed off by SS guards and Polish police. On August 20th, 1942, Nazi soldiers pounded on my dad's apartment door looking for his father. They commanded his dad to supervise the leveling of a field, large field near Yasna Street, I'm guessing somewhere up here, and assured the family of his safe return. Before being taken, my grandfather took my dad into the kitchen, away from the police, and took out his only valuable possession, a gold Schoppenhausen pocket watch. As he gave it to my dad, he told him to keep it hidden and to only use it in a situation where he thought it might save his life. My dad took the watch and strapped it to his ankle, not realizing that it would be the last time he would see his father. That day was the preliminary selection of the Jewish people in Kelts. The Nazis ordered all of the ghetto residents to assemble in the prepared field. The Nazi command selected older and disabled people, women and children, to immediately walk from that field to the area of the, by the train, which was at about a mile away from the prepared field. Able-bodied persons were temporarily saved for work details. My dad's mother and sister were kept because of their work in the ghetto hospital. My dad and other young men were marched to the Kelts synagogue courtyard under heavy guard. And this is an archived photo of the original Kelts synagogue, dated somewhere between 1903 and 1909. This is the synagogue building about 25 years ago when we visited Kelts. My dad is pointing to an area on the building where the Jewish stars have been sandblasted off of the facade. These young men were then taken to an area near the Zelinger River and arrived at the site of 2 mass graves. My dad's assignment was to remove valuables from the corpses and place them on a white sheet that was spread at the feet of an SS officer who guarded the workers with a machine gun in hand. My dad had to open bags of quicklime and spread the toxic material over the bodies. At one point, my dad was kicked in the stomach by one of the SS guards and fell into the grave. Laying there face down, he waited for the inevitable bullet that would kill him, but to his surprise, another prisoner was given permission to help him out of the pit. After 4 hours of work, he was marched back to the area of the synagogue, only to find that his mother and sister were taken to the trains during his absence. The emotional devastation he experienced was too difficult to describe. The Nazis liquidated almost the entire Jewish population of Celts in just 3 days. Most of the Jews were sent to their death sentences in the Treblinka concentration camp. Treblinka was established in May of 1942. 870,000 people were murdered there. The camp operated until the fall of 1943, when the Nazis destroyed the entire camp in an attempt to conceal all traces of their crimes. Today, all that remains on the grounds at Treblinka are memorial stones and a very small portion of railroad ties. I know these photos are a little dark, but this first one says Celts, the second one says Bodzenten, and the third is one of my dad lighting a memorial candle on one of those stone monuments. Only about 2,000 people of a total of 28,000 now remained in Celts to work as slave laborers in camps called Arbeitslagers. Arbeit is the German word for work, and Lager is the word for camp. By the spring of 1943, another 1,500 people were sent to concentration camps, leaving only approximately 500 prisoners. My dad and his 3 dearest childhood friends, Sidney, Jake, and Natka, were interned at 2 of these camps located on the outskirts of Celts. Similar to the ghetto, the camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences and heavily guarded. Every day, the prisoners were forced to walk the 4 miles to and from the camp under armed guards. My dad worked in the Henrikov factory, making cast iron axles for the German army wagons. The conditions were horrific. 400 inmates living in old horse stables, 2 to a bunk with 3 tiers each. The fleas, bed bugs, and lack of food were intolerable, but they were still alive. He bunked with his childhood friend Sidney, while Natka was sent to the women's quarters and worked in the infirmary. My dad heard stories about the killings at Treblinka from contacts outside the camp and began to formulate a plan to escape with his 2 friends. He was taken from the factory and put on a work detail, moving heavy confiscated furniture items up 6 flights of stairs to be stored in the attic of a Gestapo warehouse. While working there one day, he found a pair of knee-high army boots. Knowing that he would need them for his escape, he put them on upon leaving for the night and hid his wooden prisoner clogs in the attic. During another trip to the attic, he found a small pistol and strapped it to his thigh under his pants. Even though he would face certain death if he was caught with the pistol, he marched back to the camp under the usual guard. One day, one of his campmates told him that he had found a hidden German Luger pistol and 7 bullets. Knowing that guns were a necessity for escape, my dad remembered his father's words and traded the precious gold watch for the pistol and bullets. In April of 1944, he was transferred to work the night shift and chose the night of May 12th to escape. If the escape was successful, they planned to run to the nearby Holy Cross Forest and survive there until the Soviet army lines were close. They had a better chance of survival living in the forest during the summer than in the brutal cold weather of winter. My dad and Sidney waited for Natka inside the factory building, but found out that she had been captured within the camp. She was beaten and ultimately sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. My dad was heartbroken, but forced himself to carry out the escape without her. They quietly walked to the latrine building. My dad stood on Sidney's shoulders to climb onto the building roof, and then Sidney went inside the latrine and stood on the bench. The roof had an opening in it. My dad was able to reach down, grab Sidney's arm, and pull him through the opening and onto the roof. They jumped down from the building, cut a hole through the barbed wire fence surrounding the camp, and ran for their lives. They heard the camp alarm and saw searchlights go on. And at almost the exact same time as their escape, they heard planes flying overhead. Fearing an impending attack on the camp, the guards shut off the searchlights, and my dad and Sidney were able to run away in the darkness toward the nearby forest. Their goal was to break through the German lines and reach the Soviet side. They stayed on the edges of the forest while trying to make their way to Dobrova. My dad had a good friend living there who was a Polish partisan fighting against the Germans. They found him and wanted to join his group of Polish partisans, but his friend told him it would be too dangerous if partisans found out that Jews were hiding and living in the forest. He told my dad that he knew of a Jewish family that had been hiding in the forest for almost 2 years. They lived exposed to the elements of nature and moved from place to place within the forest because they were fearful of being found by the villagers, foresters, and other partisans. My dad became the leader of the forest families, which grew to include 18 people. They survived by foraging for food in the forest and nearby villages, often sharing a few potatoes for a meal. They used stone and railroad signs made of tin to put over their heads for some kind of shelter. And to avoid detection, their movement within the forest was constant. Within the dense forest, it was easy to lose one's sense of direction. While changing locations in the middle of the night, my dad used to feel the tree trunks searching for moss, which typically grew on the north side of the trees. One day, while searching for food, my dad and 3 friends were captured by Polish soldiers on the outskirts of the forest near some railroad tracks that passed through the area. They were interrogated and then marched into a huge clearing in the forest. They feared that they would be murdered. My dad heard a train approaching and thought this was his only opportunity to escape. The soldiers wouldn't risk firing their rifles because the noise would draw the attention of the German troops that were passing by on the train. In a split second, my dad yelled to his friends in Yiddish and told them that they needed to do what they could, but that he was going to run for his life. He took off running and was shot in his back, but miraculously, the bullet lodged near his lung and didn't kill him. I think my dad was somewhat tormented by leaving his friends to fend for themselves. In his book, he wrote, I did not purposefully abandon my compatriots, but my escape had been instinctive, dictated by the forces of self-preservation and the knowledge that there was no alternative but certain death. He later returned to the forest and found that the men had been killed. Life in the forest was becoming dire because the winter of 1944 to 45 was brutally cold. With starvation and frostbite setting in, the group of 18 was now down to 8. In desperate need of food and escape from the cold, my dad set out in an attempt to make contact with friendly partisans around the forest. He was stunned when he came upon a Soviet soldier driving a dog sled carrying wounded Soviets. This meant that the Soviets had overtaken the Germans in their area. Making a very long story short, he and his friend Sidney made their way back to Kelts. When they were there, they were recruited to work for the Soviets, translating German war documents. And my dad's bullet was actually removed in a Soviet army hospital. Upon their return to Kelts, they found the population had lingering anti-Semitism. In fact, there was a pogrom, which is defined as an organized massacre of helpless people against the Jews of Kelts on July 4th, 1946. This date is important because the war was officially over. On July 1st, a 9-year-old Polish Christian boy from Kelts went missing. He had gone to visit friends in a neighboring town, and when he returned 2 days later, he told his father that he had been kidnapped by Jews and held in the cellar of the Jewish community building, but managed to escape. And this is a photo of the building, which was located at Plenty 7. The boy's father filed a police report persuaded by Christian neighbors who were worried about Jews returning to Kelts and reclaiming their homes. The investigation revealed that the building in question didn't even have a cellar, and the rumor sparked a violent pogrom. 36 Jews were murdered in their homes and on the streets. 6 more were murdered on the train passing through the city. Jews were shot, stabbed, stoned, and beaten. 42 people were murdered and 80 more were wounded. This action prompted tens of thousands of Polish Jewish survivors to flee their country of origin and travel to safer and less anti-Semitic places. And this is a memorial plaque commemorating the pogrom, which is written in Polish, English, and Hebrew. And in English, it says, in memory of the 42 Jews murdered on July the 4th in 1946 during anti-Semitic riots. Commemorating plate is built in the anniversary of this event by the Nissenbaum Foundation on the initiative of Lech Walesa, the leader of Solidarity. My dad left Kelts months before the pogrom occurred because he had little hope of reestablishing a life in the city. He and two friends ended up traveling to Bavaria, Germany, and then to Munich in hopes of enrolling in the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration University. This organization enabled survivors to complete their college degrees. While at the university, he lived with a German couple, Anna and Karl Gemeiner. My dad had very fond memories of them and felt that they cared for him as if he were their son. And these are pictures of my dad at the university, some of his documents. That's his study book. This shows his classes, bacteriology, pathology, medicine, and I guess the grades that he got, and his photo ID for the school. My mom, Helen, was also a student at the university pursuing a degree in dentistry. She was from Sosnowiec, Poland. And when the war ended, her family was relocated to a displaced persons camp in Landsberg, Germany. My parents met at the university and were married in Landsberg on March 20th, 1949. They lived with the Gemeiners until they both graduated in March of 1950. They immigrated to the United States on August 10th, 1950 on an Army transporter named the General McRae. And this is a copy of the ship's log, and you can see my parents' names highlighted in yellow. And they arrived in the port of New York City 12 days later. They entered a free but foreign world. They learned a few English words while on the ship and owned some meager possessions and approximately 50 US dollars. My mom was the dentist for the ship's dental office, and the $50 she earned was given to her in tips from the sailors she took care of. They didn't stay in New York City for very long and moved to Milwaukee, where my mom's parents and brother had settled. My dad was admitted to the medical intern class at Mount Sinai Hospital in Milwaukee. Since he was a doctor living in the state of Wisconsin, he was obligated to register for Army Selective Service. He and my mom moved to Chicago, where he took his medical board exams and got his license to practice his specialty of obstetrics and gynecology. My brother was born, and just as his new family life was beginning, my dad was dispatched to Seoul, Korea, to serve as a doctor in the Army's 5th Medical Company. He wasn't even a naturalized American citizen yet, but was eventually sworn in while serving in Korea. He returned home after 16 months in Korea and settled in Chicago. I was born a few years later, and our family was complete. My dad was a respected obstetrician and brought thousands of newborn babies into the world during his 40 years in practice. He retired in 1995 and enjoyed spending winters in Florida, time with his children and grandchildren, and pursuing his hobbies. My dad used to say that as he struggled to survive the Holocaust, he never thought he'd live long enough to grow old. He lived for 99 years, raised a wonderful family, had 4 beautiful grandchildren and 1 adorable great-granddaughter. Several years ago, my parents had the opportunity to obtain a maple tree sapling from the Chicago Botanic Garden. It was grown using seeds derived from a maple tree that grew in the Terezin concentration camp, which was nurtured by the young children who were imprisoned in the camp during the Holocaust. It's a symbol of life and resilience and is planted on the grounds of the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. And this poem written by my dad is etched into a plaque. Now the days are numbered, the eyewitness pool is shrinking fast, and those who live through the horror of brutal force and tragic loss will soon leave this world behind. We are the trustees, those who met their end at Treblinka and the other factories of death. Do not let the wicked deny the truth while you still have the strength to speak. Open your wounds despite the pain. Keep memory alive as long as you can, for those who hear you now will keep it forever, long after you're gone. With a similar theme, my dad ended his book with the following epilogue. I lived through such tragic loss of innocent life. Many of those who died, no doubt, would have brought rich benefits to all of humanity. When the Holocaust started, my daily struggle for survival absorbed all of my energies. I planned and acted in order to survive and be a living witness to the atrocities I saw and to the annihilation of my people. I partially fulfilled this promise in June of 1995 by giving testimony to Steven Spielberg survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. And with the publication of this book, I've completed the obligation to myself and to the others who suffered and are not able to tell their stories. I hope that this remarkable story can provide hope that some form of good can survive in the midst of evil. Thank you so much for tuning in. Join us here next Wednesday, July 7th at 10 a.m. Central Time to hear Dina Kobrinsky share her family story. And please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we'll post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times.
Thanks, Lucy. You open for a couple questions?
Sure.
All right. The first one is, when did you first start to learn your father's story? You know, when did he start kind of sharing that with you?
You know, I have memories of stories being relatively young, maybe not so much directed toward me, but my parents' closest groups of friends were survivors that were living in Chicago. His friend that he was in grade school with and college with, there was a whole group of them. And so I would hear stories, and I think that my dad suppressed a lot of his stories because he lost his whole family. And I think that's what prompted me to ask him to put his memoirs together. I knew bits of stories. I knew a story here, but I couldn't put them together chronologically. And I wanted to have that information for myself, my family, my children to pass on. And so I had asked him, God, now it's probably, 25, 30 years ago, or maybe not 30 years ago, if he could do that for me so that I would have it. And it was very cathartic for him because it just kind of opened up, I think, a Pandora's box of feelings and this, I think, some of the stories on an emotional level are just the tip of the iceberg. And so then he was, he was ultimately very open, and we were able to ask questions and find out as much detail about his history as we could.
And his memoir is amazing. So what brought you to the point of sharing his story?
Well, I think, like he said in the book, I know that was one of his main reasons that drove him to survive, was to be able to survive, to not just tell his story, but tell the story for all those people who didn't survive, and to be a witness, because that witness pool now, my dad died at 99. My mom, God bless her, is still 90, almost 96 and alive. And we're losing that generation who were eyewitnesses to those atrocities. So I think that was a very, very important thing for him. And, it's my privilege to carry that message.
What was it like, or what was your experience like growing up as a child of a survivor?
Oh, that would take about 5 hours of discussion and therapy. But it's different. As assimilated, I have to say it's different. My parents came here with nothing, total nothing, almost no language. Like I said, my mom literally earned $50 in tips while on that ship. And so they were totally driven to provide a good life for themselves, myself and my brother, provide us with great education, worked hard. But it was different because they weren't American, right? So their culture was a little different. Some of the values, I think, I think when people physically go through that and lose the trust of the people around them or their neighbors, their friends, and realize that you only have yourself and maybe one good friend to rely on, that you really have to rely on yourself. So it was a little different, but I think my parents both instilled that, it doesn't matter like what difficulties you encounter in your life. Like, nothing's impossible, right? When you think about people having to struggle on a literally maybe an hourly or daily basis about whether or not they're going to live, then the fact that relatively minor things are not unsurmountable. Let me put it that way. That you can probably tackle just about anything. I don't know if that helps, but
No, it does. It's brilliant. You mentioned visiting Kels. What was that trip like?
oh, that trip honestly was like an emotional roller coaster. My dad at one point said, "You have to realize the last time when we were walking down, I can't pronounce the name of the main street there, which was still the main street, that I was not allowed to walk on this side of the street." And so there was a lot of, on my dad's part, I think there was a lot of bitterness. Even going back to that area of the synagogue and seeing things, it was no longer a synagogue. It archived like supposedly historical documents, but there was no semblance of anybody being Jewish there except for the Jewish cemetery and the gravestones. So without my dad or my mom telling their stories, you could walk through there and just have no idea that Jews, again, other than the cemetery, you'd have no idea that Jews even lived there. There were times when both of my parents were telling childhood stories, and it was wonderful. And then, like, you see my dad walking up to, wasn't on that trip, that was a subsequent trip he took back to Poland, but walking up, or when we were at Tokarnia at the plant, and my dad is just walking up to people saying, how did you get this apartment? It was still there. So it was kind of like a surreal experience in a way.
Oh, one last question. What kind of advice or takeaway do you want people to have from hearing your father's story?
Well, I think especially in today's climate and all that we hear on the news and things that are going on around the world, and particularly in the United States, I think that we all have to be mindful that the prejudice that some people can hold, no matter what they're holding it towards, can become virulent and violent and pervasive. And that possibility, I believe, always exists. So I think if people can be accepting and as open as they possibly can, and not naive to think that some of the hatred that is spewed can't keep growing, I think that you have to be, as we always say in the museum, an upstander and speak up for what you really believe in, and speak out when you see things that you think are not appropriate or not right. Then if you can take that away and also know and pass on that legacy that, there are still, the Holocaust did exist. These people did survive these tragedies, and it should be a lesson for future generations.
Thank you. That's a powerful message to end it on. That's all the questions I'm seeing. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you.